It's a key time in Washington with $1.3 trillion in U.S.-Canada trade on the line. And for the first time since Donald Trump slammed the door on negotiations after that Ontario TV ad, Mark Carney's point person on trade has come to the Capitol for renewed discussions. It comes during a review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. And on the heels of the Prime Minister's visit to Australia, where he renewed the stance he outlined in Davos.
The world will always be driven by great powers, but it can also be shaped by middle powers that trust each other and act with speed and purpose. And the question today for middle powers like us is whether we establish the conventions and help write the new rules that will determine our security and prosperity, or let the hegemons dictate outcomes.
I spoke earlier with Carlo Dade, a trade expert at the new Norrh America Initiative. Carlo, thanks for joining us. You've spoken before about how the U.S. has deployed a strategy of weaponized uncertainty when it comes to trade against countries like Canada. What do you mean by that, and how can Canada fight back?
Well, in terms of what weaponized uncertainty means, the Americans have figured out that they want to move production to the U.S. They want Canadian firms that sell products in the U.S. to make those products in the U.S., give U.S. workers jobs, et cetera, et cetera. One way is to set a high tariff, a high cost. And companies say, my God, if it's going to cost me that much, I can't sell in the U.S. I have to move my production to the U.S. to avoid the tariff. The other way is to have a tariff that moves constantly. If you set a tariff at, say, 10%, firms can run the numbers, figure out whether or not they can continue to cut corners, cut costs, whether they can continue to sell the product in the U.S. from Canada. But if they don't know what the tariff will be, if it's going to change every day or every week or every tweet, they can't run the numbers. They can't figure out, they can't prepare, and then they're forced to throw up their hands and say, look, if I want to sell in the U.S., I'm just going to have to move production into the U.S. The Americans have been working on this since before Trump came in. Robert Lighthizer, former U.S. trade representative, a name familiar to most Canadians, was working on this before the Trump administration came in, and there was publications from U.S. think tanks affiliated with the America First movement laying out this plan.
I think most Canadians look at what's happening and they either think that the president changing his minds on tariffs at random is just his unpredictability. You're saying it's a deliberate strategy, though.
I'm saying it's both. I think someone was smart enough to take advantage of the president's unpredictability and leverage it. But the idea is there, and the planning with the think tanks in the U.S. was there, but all that changes when it hits Donald Trump. This was just a fortuitous for the Americans, unfortuitous for the rest of us, coincidence where his unpredictability actually worked with a strategy, or perhaps just evolved into a strategy. Bottom line for us is it really doesn't make a difference because it's really, really harming us. And the other bit about this is the Americans have figured out that they don't actually have to impose the tariff and suffer the cost. The threat of the tariff itself is enough to force companies to think about moving to the U.S. So the Americans have the best of both worlds, the ability to threaten a tariff and get the change without having to impose the cost on Americans of actually imposing the tariff.
So you hear Prime Minister Carney speak about the relationship with the United States and globally, and it seems like he is trying to adapt to what's going on here in Washington right now. Has he succeeded, though, in fundamentally changing the relationship between Ottawa and Washington, or are there factors back in Canada that are really working against him no matter what he does on the trade file?
He definitely is trying to improve the relationship. That's a task where we've got a lot of digging out of the hole to do. Resisting or imposing counter-tariffs. There were only two countries that imposed counter-tariffs. One was China, the other's Canada. And in this town, that's not forgotten. So that is something that's going to linger in terms of our relationship with the U.S.
I think a lot of Canadians are in this space right now where they almost feel like they're being bullied by Washington. But are there things that Canada has done or not done that have actually created the situation where it's easy to take advantage of us?
Well, in terms of bullying, welcome to the club. It's a large group of countries, pretty much every country out there that's also being bullied. So the exceptionalism that we feel, that we've historically felt with the U.S., is the first thing we've got to lose if we're going to deal with this administration. Canadians have what has become almost a sense of entitlement. At least that's the way it's read here in Washington. That's kind of baffling and annoying to Americans. The way we view the relationship, the friendship, the long history of working together is to some degree appreciated, don't get me wrong, but not to the degree that Canadians think and have come to expect.
What kind of leverage does Canada have in these negotiations with the U.S.?
Not much. Obviously, if you look at oil, we supply a great deal of oil. There's certain regions of the U.S. where we're the primary supplier for oil supplies, oil reserves. Potash is another area we have a great deal of leverage. I think we control, I'm going to make up numbers here, but 80% of the world's potash. The Americans rely on us for potash imports. And this is a fertilizer. You can't grow corn or wheat without potash. So the American agricultural industry is dependent in the extreme on Canadian potash. But do you want to use this leverage? Do you want to threaten the Americans with starvation or threaten the American agricultural industry by withholding? We really don't have leverage, and even when we do have leverage, the ability to use it in the case of potash is questionable. We have the history of the relationship. We have integrated supply and production chains. Cars cross the border 8 times. Beef crosses the border 4 times before it gets to the end product. So we have the leverage of integration. We have the leverage of not being a problem for the U.S. on the border. If the Americans had to spend on the northern border what they spend on the Mexican border, the U.S. deficit would move a couple decimal points. So we have the leverage of things people don't always think about, not just natural resources, but cooperation on the border, working with the Americans on security in the Caribbean. There are lots of little things that aren't in the public eye that are important to the Americans. Whether or not we want to use those and whether or not it will work with this administration is a whole different question.
In your view, what is the attitude toward Canada here in Washington? Is there a view that we can be steamrolled? Is there a view that we're a reliable partner that can actually be negotiated with?
I don't know. I don't know. With this administration, it's really hard to tell. If you look at what they've done with other countries, and I just don't mean Cambodia and Liechtenstein, but the EU, the UK, Japan, you've seen those countries have to come to terms with the U.S., have to make concessions without receiving concessions. So in terms of preparing the Canadian public, the mindset switch, the idea that we're going to get a zero tariff deal with the Americans, that we are going to be treated from other countries, that we are special, has got to change back home. That is going to get us into so much trouble. And domestically, when a zero tariff deal doesn't emerge, we can't be surprised, alarmed, and upset. Instead, we have to be prepared, we have to be ready for this, and we have to be focused on responding because we've already started thinking about this, we've already started making adjustments. So the mindset switch back home is key. Government, but also businesses and Canadian citizens to understand what's coming. It's going to be a tariff. The special treatment is not going to be there. Don't wind up on day 0 being shocked and running around like chickens with our heads cut off, but instead we need to begin preparing for that now. And saying things like we're going to get a zero tariff or that's possible is harmful, it's not helpful.
Carlo, thank you so much for your time.
All right.